This is lesson 8-7, factoring special cases. These are perfect squares up to 20 that you need to get familiar with for this lesson and beyond. It's very important that we recognize both perfect square trinomials and the difference of two perfect square binomials in order to have simplified factoring in this lesson. If you don't know any of these squares, I would recommend that you pause the video at this point to write them down. So here's how to factor perfect square trinomials. The first thing is you have to have three things. It must be a trinomial, which is three terms. The first and last terms must be perfect squares. And the middle term must be twice the product of one factor from each perfect square term. Here's some examples of what I'm talking about. So it looks like this, where we have a squared plus 2ab, a factor from each of the perfect squares, a and b, 2 times that. When we factor that, it looks like a plus b times a plus b, or a plus b quantity squared. Likewise, on the second example, it's just a minus instead, and then we'll have a minus b quantity squared. Here are some examples. Factor each of these trinomials into two binomials. Pause the video at this point to give yourself a chance to do them on your own. Here are your answers. The first one, we're looking at x and 36 in the front and back. They're perfect squares. And 12x is the 2 times the product of 6 and x. So we have x minus 6 quantity squared. With the second one, I'm looking at 4x squared being a perfect square, 25 being a perfect square. So I have the quantity 2x plus 5 squared. Let's take a look at the rules for what we call dots factoring, difference of two squares. Again, you need three things. This time it has to be a binomial. You must have subtraction this time. You have to have subtraction. And both of the terms must be perfect squares. Here's an example of what it looks like. A squared minus b squared gives you a plus b times a minus b. And to break it down a little simpler, take the square root of both terms and use one of each sign. The plus sign and a minus sign. See the plus sign here and the minus sign here. Make sure that you use one of each sign. And there's an example with a number like 4. We break it down into 2 and 2. Let's take a look at some examples of dots factoring. Pause the video at this point to give yourself a chance to do the examples on your own. So all of these are difference of two perfect squares. To factor x squared minus 9, we take two sets of parentheses, and we have x plus 3 and x minus 3. For the second one, again, perfect squares and subtraction, along with it being a binomial, we have x plus 5 and x minus 5. Next one, when you break it down, 2x plus 9, 2x minus 9. And finally, the last one, 6x squared y to the 4th plus 8z, and then 6x squared y to the 4th minus 8z. If you have any difficulty with this particular lesson, please make sure you're consulting your teacher inside of class.